Straight Shift with the Car Chick, the podcast that's all about cars, buying, selling, fixing, and driving, and sometimes running fast if you're the Car Chick. Now, here she is.
Hey everyone, and welcome to the Straight Shift. I have gotten a lot of calls in the past few weeks from people who were in some way or another in trouble on their lease. Either they had a unexpected change in their financial situation that prevented them from being able to make their current lease payments on the nice car they had, or they were over their mileage or somehow upside down on the lease and, we're really concerned about how do I get out of this? How do I deal with this overage? So I thought I would do an episode today about what to do if you find yourself in trouble on your lease and how can you get out of a lease so that you can get yourself into a better position. And this is the main reason that when I'm working with my clients and I have someone who says they're interested in leasing, I really vet them. I mean, I really interrogate them to make sure that they are a good lease candidate because leasing does have a lot of risks associated with it. So I want to make sure that the people I work with are good lease candidates to try and minimize the risk of, something happening and them getting into trouble. But life happens and we can't predict the future. And sometimes, you do lose a job or business changes or, you move across town or to another state and you're driving more, unexpected child on the way. We weren't expecting to have another child. This happens. And so, you might need to get into a different vehicle. So since we know that life happens, I want to talk about ways of dealing with your lease situation so that you can get yourself out of trouble. And there are a lot more ways to do that than the dealers and the leasing companies will tell you about. So these are going to be some of my insider secrets. We're going to talk about what to do if you get to the end of your lease and you're over your miles, or if you get partway through your lease and you realize, oh boy, I'm driving a lot more than I thought I would, and I'm going to be over my miles. What do I do? As well as, what happens if you need to get out of your lease early for either financial or lifestyle reasons. So we're going to talk through all of that and look at what the options are. But before I get started doing that, we need to once again talk about what a lease really is. And I think of a lease as just a slightly different way of financing a vehicle. You are basically borrowing the vehicle, renting it, taking a loan out on just the portion of it that you intend to use instead of financing the entire cost of the car. So when you start thinking of it that way, there are a lot of options around getting out of leases that aren't that much different than getting out of a car that you have a traditional loan on. And people can find themselves in just as much trouble doing that, especially if they have financed it for 60 or even 72 months without a down payment, or they rolled over a lot of negative equity and are essentially financing two vehicles and only getting to drive one. So, there's a lot of different ways you can get yourself in financial trouble with cars, whether you're leasing or buying, but the ways to get out of that can be similar. One thing I want to warn you about is that a lot of people get talked into leasing because of that attractive lower monthly payment. And one of the things that I hear so many salespeople at the dealership say is, oh, don't worry about the miles. If you come back and lease another or buy another car from us, the manufacturer will forgive the miles. So don't even worry about that. Just drive as much as you want. This is complete 100% horse hockey, and you should not believe it. And it totally pisses me off when salespeople lie to the customer about this. No one is going to just forgive the mileage, because the reason that the lease sets the mileage at a certain limit is because the leasing company has determined that if you drive the car for 3 years and put 36,000 miles on it, it's going to probably be worth X amount of dollars on the secondary market at that point. And that's where they set their residual value, which is what is used to calculate the lease. So if you drive it more than you promised you would, of course it's going to cost you money at the end, because the car is not going to be worth as much as it would be had you stuck to your mileage. So the concept of forgiving mileage is flat out a lie. It does not happen What they're really saying is that, oh, well, we'll find a way to roll it over into another lease or loan, as negative equity and just not tell you about it. So you won't realize you're financing two cars at the same time. So that just really ticks me off. So if you ever hear a salesperson tell you not to worry about the mileage on a lease, that is complete BS, and you need to just walk out of there because they're lying to you. Okay, I'm going to take a deep breath now that I've been pissed off, and we'll just go into what your actual options are if you find yourself over your miles, particularly at the end of your lease. The first thing you need to do, and you need to start this process if you can, a few months before the lease comes due, really try and start thinking about it. If, life just gets crazy and, you're like, oh crap, my lease has come due and I'm in trouble and you need time to figure it out, call your leasing company and ask them to extend your lease for a month, 2 months. Sometimes they'll go up to 6 months. Almost every leasing company will do that. Just say, I just need a little bit more time. And you just keep making your monthly payments and they adjust the residual accordingly. So you can almost always extend your lease. So give yourself more time if you need to versus, panicking and making a hasty decision that will probably end up costing you thousands of dollars. So step one, you need to determine just how screwed you are. Calculate how far over your mileage is and then multiply that by the price tag that they put per mile at the beginning of your lease. It's usually somewhere in the neighborhood of 25 cents a mile, but go back to your leasing documentation, all the paperwork you signed when you leased the car. It will be in there. It's required to be in that lease contract, but it's typically 20 to 25 cents a mile. So do the math and see just how much those overage charges are going to be. If they're only a few $100s, then that may not be a big deal. If it's $1,000, maybe that's not as big of a deal. You can probably roll that over into another loan, just like you would any other type of negative equity on a car you're trading in, or you can throw some cash at it. But you can also take a look at, okay, what is the true trade-in value, the actual market value of my car versus what you owe on it. Typically, if you are over your mileage, you're not going to be able to get out of it equity-wise. That negative equity as a true trade value will probably be worse than the calculation of the overage charges. But again, it never hurts to get that information. And the way you would find that out is literally just drive your car to a couple of franchise dealers. So let's say, you've leased a Honda, take it to a couple different Honda stores and just tell them, hey, I'm just looking to sell my car outright. Don't tell them that it's a leased car. They don't need to know any of that. Say, I'm not interested in buying anything new. I'm merely looking at selling my car outright. Would you like it for your lot? Because typically if you have a leased car and it hasn't been in any accidents and you've taken good care of it like you're supposed to, it'll be a good car that they can certify and then resell as a certified pre-owned car on their lot. So theoretically, the franchise dealer will pay a little bit more for it than if you took it to, say, CarMax or some independent dealer that can't sell it for as much money. But typically, if you're over your miles, that actual cash value of selling it to a dealer is probably, that negative equity is probably going to be larger than the overage charges. Really depends on what the terms of your original lease were. But again, it doesn't hurt to have that information because the more quantitative information you have, the better decisions you can make. So determine which of those is going to be the lesser of two evils, and then you'll know more what your options are going to be. You may be able to roll that negative equity over into another loan or a lease. Typically, if you want to roll over just the overage charges, you can typically only do that if you buy or lease another of the same car. So that Honda, if you buy or lease another Honda, then they will be able to roll over the overage charges into a new loan. Financially, again, not the best idea, but sometimes, we just have to go with the lesser of the evils and it could be an option for you. If you decide, no, this time I want a Toyota, they're not going to have as many options for rolling over the negative equity and they're going to look at your car more as a trade-in and you may be stuck with that actual trade value, which has a higher negative equity than the cash. But you can ask. They may be able to do it. A lot of that really depends on the manufacturer. It depends on the laws in your state. But sometimes, no matter how much, which way you go, if you have a lot of overage charges, if it's in the thousands, and believe me, I have seen this. I have seen people that have been over double their miles on the lease, and they owed $5,000 or $6,000 in overage charges. You may not be able to roll over all of that negative equity. It may be too high to roll just completely into another lease or a loan, in which case you're going to have to come up with some cash to throw at it. This is why, if you're starting to get over on your miles, usually you don't go over your miles in the last 2 months of your lease. This has usually been accumulating for quite a while, and people don't always realize when it's happening. But as soon as you realize your situation has changed and that you might go over your miles on your lease, even if you're not sure, but you might, the best time to deal with that situation is right then and there, because when you're still in the middle of the lease, you may have more options. A lot of leasing companies will allow you to renegotiate the lease or buy more miles midway, often for less than that 25 cents they're going to charge you at the end. Sometimes you can, if you buy them up front or if you buy them midway through the lease, it's 15 cents a mile. But a lot of the leasing companies are flexible with this. They understand that people get in trouble. They end up over their miles. And if you're savvy enough and on the ball enough to anticipate this and call them and say, I need more miles, I'm going to be going over, most of them have some way to work with you on that. Yes, your monthly payment is going to go up, but it may be more palatable to, pay another $50 a month or so on the lease now and pay that over the next, year or two than getting to the end of your lease and all of a sudden you get hit with this $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 overage bill that you have to figure out how to deal with. So if you can catch it mid-lease or as soon as possible and deal with it then, you are way better off. But again, life happens and people don't necessarily pay attention, or they don't have time to deal with it, or they just don't even think about it until they get to the end and then they realize they're screwed. You always have the option to keep your car. Hopefully you like the car still, it still meets your needs, but sometimes you have no other choice but to keep that car by either buying out or refinancing the lease. It is much better to refinance it directly through your bank or your credit union instead of going through the formal buyout process, which typically the leasing company is going to funnel you to the dealership to do that. In which case the dealer is going to charge you a whole bunch of bogus fees that you really shouldn't have to pay to buy out your own damn car. So there are some states where the way the laws are for franchising, it's part of the franchise agreement between the manufacturer and their dealerships in those states that they require by law you to go to the dealership. I've only experienced that once, and it's Hyundai in South Carolina. If you have a Hyundai in South Carolina, you can't just refinance it. You have to go through the dealership, and that's part of their franchise agreement that they negotiated in South Carolina. But again, this varies by state and by manufacturer and their independent franchise agreements. So your first step should be to figure out if you can just refinance it. And you do that by just going directly to your bank or your credit union and saying, hey, I want to refinance my lease. And they know how to handle that process. And so it's really different than refinancing a traditional loan because, a traditional loan has a payoff amount. Well, so does a lease. So you just need to find out what that current payoff is, the current 10-day payoff, and you can call the leasing company and ask for that. If I were to pay off my lease now, what would that be? They will tell you that number, and the bank can find that out and you can refinance it just like you would otherwise. Now, where it gets a little bit different is that you will probably have to pay some amount of taxes, and you're going to have to pay the tag and title fees, where if you were refinancing the loan traditionally, you wouldn't necessarily have to do that. They would just do a new lien holder and change out the title ownership. But on a lease, depending on the laws of your state, you may have to pay all the taxes up front. You may have already paid the taxes, but typically as far as your DMV and your state Department of Revenue is concerned, you're actually buying your own car. So you'll still have to pay those fees to the state and the DMV, but at least you won't have to pay like the dealer dock fee. And sometimes dealers charge you an extra like $500 or so just for the privilege of buying out your lease through them, which is BS. So if you can avoid those ridiculous fees, you can typically save yourself, $1,000 to $1,500 by avoiding doing it through the dealership. So if you can do that, that will make it better off. Now, I'm going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about what you can do if you need to get out of your lease early because of either a job change, you can't make your payments anymore, or you suddenly desperately need a very different type of vehicle because there's been a change to the size of your family or whatever. So I'll be right back, and we're going to talk about that, including lease swapping. How does that work, and is it a good idea? I'll be right back after this. Do you hate car shopping? Do you worry about being taken advantage of or about finding the right car at a great price? Buying a car can be a frustrating and time-consuming experience. But what if you could get a great deal without having to do a ton of research, without having to haggle, and without the fear of buying a lemon? You can. As your personal car shopper, the Car Chick will help you pick the perfect car based on your unique lifestyle, budget, and personality. She'll handle all of the legwork and negotiating for you. All you have to do is sign the papers and take the keys. It's that easy. To learn how the Car Chick can save you time, money, and hassle on your next car purchase, give us a call at 704-248-8706. That's 704-248-8706. Or visit us on the web at thecarchick.com.
Ah, the Car Chick is back for more Straight Shift.
Welcome back to the Straight Shift. We're talking about what to do if you find yourself in trouble on your lease. Now, if you have to get out of your lease early before the lease end date approaches, sometimes, this may happen, a year into your lease. It may happen, 2 or 2.5 years into your lease for, whatever life reasons. I've had a person call me recently who had, very unexpected financial change in a business and could no longer afford the payments on the lovely car. And unfortunately, there were limited options in that situation because the lease was only 1 year in and it was a very, very low mileage lease. And so, that was just kind of a frustrating situation that, I hated that she was in. And that's what got me thinking about doing this podcast and looking at different options. A lease can be so much harder to get out of than a traditional loan because you are only financing the portion of it you're going to use. So you're never really paying down the principal, so to speak, like you are in a traditional loan. So you are much more likely to have negative equity and a significant amount of negative equity if you're trying to get out of your lease early. As I said before, a lease is really a different way of financing a car, and you can do a lot of the same things with a leased car that you can a car that you have a traditional loan on. So you can still trade in a leased car, just like you can a car that you have a loan on. One way or another, some bank is sitting there holding the title to it. It doesn't really belong to you yet anyway. So it's just a matter of, what value can you negotiate for it, selling it to a dealership, either outright or trading it in, then that amount is a trade value. It doesn't matter that it's a leased car. So it's just you're probably going to have a lot more negative equity and you're unlikely to be able to get out of it without a big financial hit, especially if you didn't put any money down and, especially if you rolled over negative equity from a previous lease or loan, that just continues to dig the hole deeper. So that's why I said before, step one is always to find out what that negative equity is. And that's true whether you're trying to get out of a lease or you want to trade in the car you currently have that you have a loan for and get into something different. You could be in just as much trouble on that if you don't, if you have a lot of negative equity. And that happens when people finance a car for a long period of time or they roll over a lot of negative equity. Can you turn in a leased car early? That's one of the questions that I've been asked. The answer is yes. You can always turn in a leased car early. They just require you to make the remaining lease payments. Plus, there's usually an early termination fee. So that doesn't really help you financially. You know, you're better off trading in the car and just taking the negative equity hit usually than making the remainder of your lease payments, but it depends on how early it is. I've gotten people out of their leases where, it was just like 3 or 4 months early, and like, I just want to get out of it now. And they went ahead and made the remaining lease payments, or, we negotiated that as a rollover, and that was no big deal. But, a lot of people are trying to get out of their lease after having only been in it a few months or 1 year or 2 years, and they still have a long period of time left. So those remaining lease payments are thousands and thousands of dollars, and that's not necessarily realistic to just plunk down that chunk of change to get out of the lease. Again, you can try to roll over the negative equity into a new vehicle, but it depends on how much that negative equity is, and now you're financing 2 vehicles. So, neither of those options is really optimal if the reason you need out of it is financial in the first place. Because if you had that money, you could make the lease payments. Those situations tend to work better when it's not a financial reason, it's more of a lifestyle reason, and you have the money to just take that hit and get out of it and get the next vehicle that's going to suit you better. Again, you can, if the vehicle is fine, you can refinance the lease in the middle of it. You don't have to wait till the end of the lease and buy it out. You can refinance it, or buy it out, depending on the laws, at any point during the lease. It's just going to be the amount that you have to pay is going to be whatever the current lease payoff is. Exactly the same as if you were refinancing a loan. Just again, you will have to pay the taxes and the tag and title fees to your state Department of Revenue and DMV. Another thing you can do, at any point is try and sell the car privately, because you do get more money for a car selling it to a private individual, listing it on AutoTrader or Cars.com or whatever. Those prices that you can get are usually a little bit better than your dealer trade-in, but there are some logistical hoops, shall we say, that you have to go through with that. Sometimes a leasing company will require you to buy it from them first before you can resell it. Sometimes you don't have to. Again, if you have a car that has a traditional loan, you don't have the title in hand anyway. So typically in those situations, what happens is you just have to work the process through the bank or through the leasing company. And, if the person buying it from you is also getting a loan from their bank, if you're lucky, the banks will talk to each other and they have a process to just work that out. I've done that in the past with selling cars, and it's gone perfectly smoothly. They've handled it. They've sent everything you need. The buyer has to wait to get the title, if they're paying cash, or their bank has to wait to get the title transferred from the other bank. It's just a little more logistical hoops. These are things that happen anyway in the background when you sell your car to a dealership, but the dealership handles it. And if it goes smoothly, you never know about it. It just happens magically. But, if you're selling it on your own, then you kind of have to work through a lot of those hoops. But it can yield you a little bit more money. It's not necessarily going to yield you $5,000 or $6,000 more unless it's a really expensive car, but it may give you $1,000 or $2,000 more. And depending on your negative equity, that may be enough to get you out of it. But if you can't sell it for what you still owe on it, you would have to pay that amount in cash. So that's kind of the deal with selling a car privately. One thing that some clients have asked me about is, what about those lease swapper websites? How does that whole lease swapping thing work? So I'm going to explain that, because it's kind of a whole nother animal. If you can get a family member or a friend who wants your car to take over your payments, obviously that's going to be the easiest solution. If they're close family and they're willing to just make the payments, but the loan or the lease is still under your name, that's between y'all. There's some risks with that. But, if they want to literally take it over and have the lease put in their name, you can do that typically as well. A car lease swap literally is defined as when, you take one vehicle that is under a lease with you and you transfer it to a different person, and then the lease becomes under their name. It's the leasing equivalent of buying used cars. Now, what has to happen is the lease terms that were original to the lease that you negotiated, those apply to the new person. They have to stick to the same mileage. The payments are going to be the same. The lease terms don't change. They just assign it to a different person and they just make the remaining payments. Whatever, if you've got 6 payments left or you've got 25 payments left, they basically take on your original contract. But step one, you've got to call your leasing company to find out if they even allow it. Not all leasing companies will allow you to do that, and it's not allowed in every state. So step one is to call the leasing company and ask, hey, can my lease be transferred to another person? How much does that cost? Because let me tell you, if they allow it, they definitely charge a fee for you to do it. It's usually a few $100. Can be even higher than that. So find out how much it would cost, because typically you will be responsible for paying that fee. And then find out what their process is, because they're still going to have to vet that person. They're going to have to run their credit, go through the same process that you went through to get approved for the lease. That person is going to have to get approved before they will allow that transfer. So obviously, if you can find a friend or family member who wants to do that with you, that is great. Otherwise, there are these websites that are out there where you can list your car as, hey, do you want to take over my lease? And it's similar to, AutoTrader or Cars.com when you advertise your car, except you have to put in all of the lease terms so that a prospective transferee or swapee can see what those terms are. Those sites typically charge around $100, somewhere in there, for you to just advertise your vehicle for a certain amount of time. And then they also charge a commission of a few $100s or so when the lease transfer goes through. Obviously they want a commission on that. And again, as the person trying to get out of the lease, you are typically responsible for paying all of those fees. Now, just because you throw your car out there does not necessarily mean that someone is going to go, oh, wow, I'd love to take over that lease. A lot of it will really depend on, if it's a sweet enough deal, because the people that go out there and look to take over another person's lease, there really has to be a good incentive for them to do that versus just leasing one of these cars by themselves. So, if you happen to be looking at doing this, you need to do your diligence just as you would if you were buying a car. Make sure the car is in good shape, and you have to look and see if that lease deal is good enough. If you're in a lease on a C-Class Mercedes, but your lease payment's $800, hopefully most people are going to be smart enough to know that that's obscene and you're paying way too much for that lease for some reason. And they'd be insane to take that over because it's a bad deal. So if you want someone to take over your lease, it's got to be a good deal for them. And that's where a lot of people decide to put a cash incentive out there. Say, hey, if you take over my lease, you'll get this deal, plus I'll give you $4,000 or $7,000 to take this over. Again, that's a big cash hit to you trying to get out of your lease, but you probably wouldn't be trying to get out of your lease if you weren't desperate. So it's very common to see those types of incentives out there. I've gone to a lot of these sites and just perused them to look and see what kind of vehicles are out there and what do the lease deals look like. And most of the cars that are listed, surprise, surprise, are your Highline cars. Mercedes, BMW, Porsche, Alfa Romeo, Lincoln. Yeah, I've seen a few like Toyota trucks and stuff out there, but most of the time, it's your cars that were super expensive to begin with, and people got themselves in trouble one reason or another. So, it can be a good way if you're on the kind of the buying end or the swapping end to get into a car that you might not otherwise be able to afford if the deal is sweet enough. Maybe you get to drive it for a few months or a couple of years, and it was a good deal because the person put some good incentives out there. But if you're the person trying to get out of that lease, just keep in mind, you may have to throw a pretty big cash incentive out there in order to attract someone who's going to say, hey, this is worth it to me to get into this car. Does this work? Well, obviously it does, because these websites have been out there for a very long time and clearly they're making money doing it. But there's not any hard data that says, okay, of all the cars that are advertised on our site, this percentage of them end up in lease swaps that go through. They don't advertise that information. So, and there's no other database that I was able to find that gives that information. So, they do specifically say there are no guarantees and our fees are non-refundable. So, whether it's going to work or not, it's just going to entirely depend on how awesome your car is and how you present it and whether or not it's a good deal to do. But if you're really desperate, it'll probably only cost you around $100 to at least put it out there and give it a try. Just be sure you really look through all of the frequently asked questions and the process that is described on the website. Look at a couple different of these, lease swapping trading websites to find out, which one seems to have the most hits. If you Google lease swapping, which ones come up first? They have the best SEO, so more people are going to find them because you want to put your car out there, on the places where people are going to find them the most, the biggest lease trading or lease swapping sites. I'm not mentioning any of them by name because I don't endorse these sites at all, and it's not something that I deal in. So, just Google and do your homework and, give it a shot. You may have to list your car on one or the other, but, there are a lot of different ways to get out of a lease. It's usually not easy, especially if you're in a financial pickle and, you may have to refinance the car and keep it for a while longer, and you may have to, turn it back into the leasing company. If you really are in a very, very bad financial situation, just like if you couldn't make the payments on the loan anymore and you've exhausted all your possibilities of getting out of it, refinancing it, swapping it, if you have to basically do a voluntary repossession, that is going to significantly hurt your credit. Now, a voluntary repo typically hurts your credit less than an involuntary one. And if the bank has to come after you and send the repo man out to, snag your car in the middle of the night, that's going to be worse. I am not an expert on how these work, with the credit bureaus, but just know that if you find yourself into that situation, you are going to take a significant hit to your credit. So exhaust all of your other possibilities first before you go that route. So I hope that none of you get in this situation where you're in trouble on a lease. This is why putting a mitigation plan in place at the start when you lease the vehicle to say, okay, if something in my life changes and I need to get out of this, what am I going to do? Have that plan in place. Know what your options are ahead of time. Then you're better off. And if you think to yourself, wow, if I get a year down the line and something happens, with this lease and, I've got to get out of it and it's going to be harder to get out of than if I were to purchase the car and finance it, for a reasonable period of time, then you need to ask yourself, should you be leasing? It's one of the risks. And so really ask yourself that and look at your finances and make sure that you've got some cushion in case something does come up and you find you have to get out of it early. I am financially very conservative, so I like to make sure that my clients are really looking ahead and they understand the big picture and they're not setting themselves up for, a bad situation because as we know, life happens. But if you do find yourself in one of these situations and you're going through these options and trying to figure out what to do, if you have questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me. You can contact me through the website, thecarchick.com. There's a contact form there. You can reach me via email or you can call. I'm happy to walk through your situation with you and just give you my professional opinion on what I think you should do. And if I can help you get out of it, I absolutely will. So folks, thank you for listening. And until next time, I'm out of here. Drive safely.
The Straight Shift Podcast is copyright Leanne Shattuck, The Car Chick, 2017. All views expressed by guest and or co-hosts are those of the guest and or co-hosts, and not necessarily those of Leanne Shattuck or The Car Chick.